The cold in the Ardennes didn't just sit on your skin, it hunted you. It found the microscopic gaps in your uniform, the worn holes in your boots, and the hairline cracks in your resolve. It was a physical weight. A suffocating blanket of white and gray pressing down on the shoulders of the 82nd Airborne Division in January 1945. First Sergeant Leonard Funk knew this cold intimately. He had been living in it, fighting in it, and killing in it for weeks. His world reduced to a monochrome nightmare of snow, ice, and sudden violence. At 2:47 p.m. on January 29, under a sky the color of a bruised plum, Funk walked around the corner of a nondescript farmhouse in the tiny Belgian village of Holzheim. He was checking on his men, 4 guards he had posted to watch over a massive group of German prisoners captured earlier that morning. It was supposed to be a routine check, a moment of administrative housekeeping in the middle of a war. But instead of order, Funk walked straight into a catastrophe. The courtyard wasn't secure. It was a trap, a German patrol, disguised in white snow capes that made them look like ghosts against the drifts, had infiltrated the perimeter, jumped the 4 American guards, and unlocked the holding pen. Now, 80 German prisoners were rearmed. Along with the patrol, nearly 100 enemy soldiers stood in the courtyard, their Mausers and MP40s leveled at the lone American who had just stumbled into their midst. Facing them was Leonard Funk, a man standing 5'5", slight of build, a former clerk from the steel country of Pennsylvania who looked more like a librarian than a warrior. A German officer, his face flushed with the adrenaline of the reversal, stepped forward and jammed the muzzle of a machine pistol into Funk's stomach. The metal dug deep into the American's gut, a cold, hard promise of death. The officer screamed, spit flying from his lips, shouting in German, demanding surrender, demanding the American get on his knees. The math was terrifyingly simple, 90 men against 1. The survival probability was 0. Leonard Funk looked at the screaming officer, looked at the wall of gray uniforms, and looked at his own terrified men kneeling in the snow with their hands behind their heads. And then, defying every instinct of self-preservation, Leonard Funk began to laugh. It started as a low rumble in his chest before erupting into a full-blown, manic cackle. He laughed right in the face of the man who was about to kill him. It was the laugh of a man who had seen the absurdity of war and decided he no longer cared about the rules. The laugh of a man who had decided that if he was going to die, he was going to die on his own terms. To understand that laughter, however, one had to understand the journey that brought the little clerk to this frozen hell. Leonard Alfred Funk Jr. was born in 1916 in Braddock Township, Pennsylvania, a hardscrabble steel town where the sky was stained with soot and the Monongahela River ran thick with industrial runoff. He wasn't the biggest kid in the yard, nor the loudest, but he possessed a quiet, steely resolve that often went unnoticed by those who only saw his small stature. When the Great Depression brought America to its knees, Funk grew up fast, trading his childhood for responsibilities. By the time he was a young man, he was managing a store, keeping track of inventory, balancing ledgers, meticulous, organized, and unassuming. When the draft board called his number in 1941, the Army took one look at him, 140 pounds soaking wet, and stamped him for a support role. They saw a clerk, a typist, someone to handle supply logistics. They didn't see the fire burning inside him. Funk didn't want a desk. He volunteered for the paratroopers. At the time, the concept of airborne was experimental and widely considered suicidal. The idea of jumping out of a perfectly good airplane behind enemy lines, surrounded, with no immediate support, attracted a specific breed of soldier, the reckless, the tough, and the crazy. Funk was none of those things. He was calculated and calm, passing every grueling physical test they threw at him to earn his jump wings before being assigned to Company C 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment. He shipped out to England, and then to the chaos of Normandy. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, the pilots, dodging a curtain of anti-aircraft fire, dropped the paratroopers miles off target. Funk landed in the dark, miles from his objective, his ankle twisting violently on impact. The pain was blinding, but while standard procedure for a lone, injured paratrooper deep in enemy territory was to hide and wait, Funk gathered his chute, ignored the agony in his leg, and started walking. Over the next few days, he became a magnet for lost souls, collecting stragglers from different units who were terrified and leaderless. Despite his rank and his injury, Funk took command, leading a ragtag group of 18 men on a 40-mile odyssey through German-occupied France, ambushing patrols and destroying communication lines until he marched them into Allied lines without losing a single man. For this, he was awarded the Silver Star. But the war wasn't done with him. By the winter of 1944, the Allied advance had stalled, and Hitler launched a massive counter-offensive through the Ardennes forest, the Battle of the Bulge. The weather turned apocalyptic as temperatures plunged to zero and snow piled waist-high. It was during this time that news trickled down the line, whispered in foxholes and shared over coffee heated on hexamine stoves, about Malmedy. On December 17, near the Bonnet crossroads, a convoy of American artillery observers had run into an SS Panzer unit. Outgunned, the Americans surrendered, were disarmed, marched into a field, and told to wait. Then, the SS opened fire. Machine guns tore through the ranks of unarmed prisoners, and those who survived the initial volley were hunted down, shot in the head by laughing German soldiers. 84 Americans were massacred. When Leonard Funk heard the story, something inside him shifted irrevocably. The Geneva Convention was dead. The rules of gentlemanly warfare were gone. The enemy wasn't just an opposing force, they were murderers. Funk made a silent vow that he would never surrender. And he would never let his men surrender. They would fight, or they would die. That resolve was tested on January 29, 1945. The 82nd Airborne was pushing back, and the order came down to Company C to seize the town of Holzheim. But Company C was shattered. The fighting brutal and casualties high. Funk, now the acting executive officer due to the loss of so many lieutenants, looked at the roster and realized he didn't have enough riflemen to take the town. He didn't complain. Instead, he marched into the headquarters tent and looked at the clerks, the cooks, and the supply runners, men who spent the war typing reports and heating rations. He told them to get their gear, transforming them into a suicide squad led by a former store clerk. They marched 15 miles through a blizzard, shivering in the biting wind, artillery shells walking closer and closer to their lines. When they reached Holzheim, Funk didn't send them in, he led them in. He was the first one through the doors, clearing houses with bursts from his Thompson submachine gun. His aggression contagious. The clerks fought like seasoned veterans because they were terrified of letting Funk down. They cleared the town, house by house, room by room, and by the early afternoon, they had captured 80 German soldiers. The prisoners were rounded up in a farmhouse courtyard, and Funk, exhausted, designated 4 men to guard them. It was a skeleton crew, but it was all he could spare before leaving to check the perimeter. 15 minutes later, he circled back to find the nightmare unfolding. The German officer screaming in his face didn't understand what he was looking at. He saw a small man, a defeated man, a clerk. He didn't see the Silver Star recipient, nor the man who had charged a German anti-aircraft battery in Holland with only 2 other soldiers to earn the Distinguished Service Cross. Funk's laughter echoed off the farmhouse walls, disarming and confusing the German soldiers who glanced at each other, wondering if the American was crazy or if this was a trick. The officer hesitated, his finger hovering over the trigger of his MP40, waiting for the American to stop laughing and beg. That hesitation was the only opening Funk needed. Still chuckling, feigning a mental break, Funk slowly moved his right hand toward his shoulder where he carried his Thompson slung over his back. Muzzle down. To the Germans, it looked like he was slowly, reluctantly unslinging the weapon to drop it in the snow, muttering incoherently, pretending to be dazed. His hand gripped the stock and his finger found the trigger guard. In a movement so fast it blurred, the clerk vanished, and the killer emerged. Funk whipped the Thompson forward from his hip. He didn't aim, he pointed. He held the trigger down. The Thompson roared, spitting .45 caliber slugs at a rate of 600 rounds per minute. The first burst caught the screaming German officer in the midsection, cutting him nearly in half. He was dead before his knees hit the snow. The laughter stopped instantly. Funk screamed at his guards to get their weapons, spinning on his heel as the Thompson sprayed a deadly arc of lead across the ranks of the enemy. Pandemonium erupted. The Germans, caught completely off guard by the ferocity of the counterattack, scrambled for cover. They had the numbers, but they had lost the initiative. Funk's 4 guards, galvanized by their sergeant's insanity, grabbed the rifles dropped by the dead Germans and opened fire. Funk was a whirlwind. He emptied his 30-round magazine in seconds. In a firefight, a reload is the most dangerous moment. But Funk's hands moved with mechanical precision. He ripped the empty stick magazine out, slammed a fresh one home, racked the bolt, and resumed firing, all while advancing on the enemy. He was shouting orders, firing, and moving, creating the illusion of a much larger force. The Germans, terrified by the demonic fury of this single American, began to break. Bullets snapped past Funk's head, and one round killed the American soldier standing next to him. But Funk didn't flinch. He walked into the fire, his Tommy gun bucking against his hip. It was over in less than 60 seconds. When the smoke cleared, 21 German soldiers lay dead in the snow. Another 24 were writhing in agony. Wounded, the remaining 45, seeing their officer dead and their comrades slaughtered by one man, threw down their weapons and raised their hands in genuine surrender. Leonard Funk stood in the center of the carnage, his barrel smoking hot, his boots stained with blood. He ejected the spent magazine and looked around at the devastation he had wrought. Then looked at his surviving men, who were staring at him as if he were a ghost or a god. Funk slung his Thompson back over his shoulder, adjusted his helmet, and shaking his head, delivered the line that would become legend in the 82nd Airborne. "That was the stupidest fucking thing I've ever seen." Months later, on September 5, 1945, the war was over, and the world was rebuilding. Leonard Funk stood in the Rose Garden of the White House, wearing his dress uniform, looking uncomfortable and unused to the attention. President Harry S. Truman, the man who had ordered the atomic bomb dropped, the most powerful man on the planet, stepped forward holding the blue ribbon of the Medal of Honor. Truman draped the medal around Funk's neck, looked the small Pennsylvanian in the eye, and said with a voice thick with emotion, "I would rather have this medal than be President of the United States." Funk accepted the honor with the same quiet humility he had carried his whole life. He didn't make a speech. He didn't capitalize on his fame. He went home to Pennsylvania, married his sweetheart, Gertrude, and got a job at the Veterans Administration. For the next 27 years, Leonard Funk sat at a desk, helping other veterans get their benefits, processing paperwork, becoming a clerk once again. To the people in his neighborhood, he was just Lenny, the quiet guy who mowed his lawn on Sundays and loved his kids. Most people had no idea that the small man stamping forms had once laughed in the face of death and killed 21 men in a single minute to save his friends. He died in 1992, living proof that true courage isn't about how tall you stand, but about where you refuse to kneel.